My name is Nora. I'm 30, and I spend my days pulling birth certificates apart for a living. I'm a paralegal in the Vital Records Division of an immigration law firm, and I can look at a certified copy and tell you in about 4 seconds whether it's the original document or a replacement issued after a court sealed something underneath it. So when my mother stood up at my own engagement dinner, tapped her wineglass, and said, "We don't need to drag up the past to know who this family is," I already had the answer sitting in my bag in a manila envelope with a county seal on it. She had no idea that in about 20 minutes, the woman she'd spent 12 years telling me didn't exist was going to be sitting 3 feet away from her, or that the reason my passport had been stuck in review for 6 weeks was about to become the only thing anyone at that table could talk about. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and walk out with their dignity intact. If you've ever been told the truth was too dangerous for you to have, this story is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. But let me back up 12 years, to the night my mother told me I was adopted in the cruelest way she possibly could have, and to the file she'd already burned 4 years before she ever said a word. I need to tell you what kind of person I was before that night, because it explains everything that came after. I've always been a person who needs the paper trail. In my job, I process delayed birth registrations, correction petitions, and international adoption paperwork for families trying to prove who their children legally are. I know the difference between a certified copy and a certified transcript. I know what a court seal looks like when it's real and when someone's had it laminated to look official. I know that in my state, an adoptee can request their original birth certificate at 18 through something called a mutual consent registry, and I know that most people who work adjacent to that system, like I do, quietly go looking for their own file within a year of learning the rules exist. I found out the rules existed the same week I found out I needed them. I grew up in Danvers, in a brick colonial with a wraparound porch my father, Frank, built himself the summer before I was born, or the summer before they say I was born into that house, which is a distinction that matters more than you'd think. My mother, Carol, ran the school fundraising committee with the kind of precision most people reserve for tax audits. My sister Tessa is 2 years younger than me, their biological daughter, and growing up I never once felt like she got more love than I did. That's the part people don't expect when I tell this story. My mother wasn't cruel to me the way you'd picture it. She came to every recital. She cried at my high school graduation. Actual tears, not performance tears. The cruelty in my house was quieter than that. It lived in one specific silence that I didn't understand was a silence until I was 18 years old, standing in our kitchen in my cap and gown, and she decided to break it in the worst possible way. It was graduation night. Family was in the living room. My grandmother's china was out, and I was riding the particular high of being young and about to leave for college, with my whole life sitting in front of me like an open door. My mother pulled me into the kitchen to help her carry out a cake, and instead she set the cake down on the counter, looked at me, and said, "You should know something before you go. You're not ours. Not by blood. We adopted you when you were 4 months old." I remember my hands went cold before my brain caught up. I asked her why she was telling me now, tonight, of all nights, and she said, "Because you're leaving, and I didn't want you finding out some other way and thinking we kept something from you." Except, she had kept something from me. When I asked, shaking, if there were papers, if there was a file, anything, anyone, she looked at me flat and said, "I burned that file when you were 9. There was nothing in it you needed." 9 words that took 18 years of my life and made them feel borrowed. I asked her why she'd burn it. She said, "Because it wasn't going to do either of us any good, and because you were given to us, Nora. That's what mattered. You were given to us." I want you to remember that phrase, because you're going to hear it 3 more times before this story is over, and by the end, it's going to mean something completely different than it did that night in the kitchen. I didn't cry in front of her. I want to be honest about that because I think some of you will understand the specific numbness of finding out the ground under you was never quite where you thought it was. I went to my graduation party. I smiled through the toasts, and I drove myself to a gas station at 11 o'clock that night and sat in the parking lot and cried until the tank of gas I didn't need was gone. Then I drove home, and I didn't bring it up again for 2 years, because I could see exactly how fragile my mother had made herself sound saying it, like she needed me to comfort her for the things she'd done to me. I'd already learned, at 18, the lesson that would define the next decade of my life. In my house, the truth about where I came from was a wound that belonged to my mother, and I was expected to manage it for her. At 20, in my sophomore year, I finally worked up the courage to ask if I could request my non-identifying information from the adoption agency. Just background, medical history, nothing that would identify anyone. My mother's face went tight in a way I'd never seen. "After everything we've given you," she said, "you want to go digging around for people who gave you away?" I told her it wasn't about them, it was about me, about wanting to know if there was a history of heart disease in my blood, something practical, something I could hand a doctor. She said, "You have a family history, it's ours." I let it go for 4 more years. At 24, I did something I never told her about, at least not at first. I sent a saliva sample to a DNA testing company, mostly out of curiosity, mostly because I told myself it wasn't really searching, just information. 6 weeks later, I had a match flagged as a close relative, 78% confidence of aunt or half-sibling. Her name was Renata. I stared at that name on my laptop screen for 11 days before I sent a message. She wrote back within an hour. She said her sister had a daughter she'd placed for adoption 30 years ago in Danvers, and that her sister had never stopped hoping the daughter would find her someday. I remember reading that sentence standing in my kitchen and having to sit down on the floor. For 4 months, Renata and I emailed. Small things at first, then bigger ones. She sent me a photograph of a woman named Naomi Reyes, 22 years old in the picture, holding a baby in a hospital blanket, and told me that was the day she signed the papers, and that she'd cried the whole drive home, and that she'd written a letter to leave with the agency in case the daughter ever came looking, a letter she was never sure had reached anyone. My mother found out because she went through my email on my laptop while I was in the shower, looking, she told me later, for evidence I'd been drinking again, which I hadn't, not since college. She read 4 months of correspondence with a woman she'd never met and decided the conversation was over before I ever got a say in it. She sat me down and said, "You have to choose, Nora. You can have this family, the one that raised you, fed you, paid for your education, or you can go play detective with strangers who gave you up. But you don't get both. Not under my roof, not with my blessing." I was 24 years old, financially independent, living 40 minutes away, and she still said under my roof, like it meant something. And the terrible truth is that it did, because some part of me was still 18 years old in that kitchen, still needing her to say I was allowed to exist the way I was. I told Renata I needed space. I stopped answering. I told myself it was temporary. It became 6 years. Here's the part that's hard to admit, and I promised myself when I decided to tell this story that I'd be honest about it. The reason I let my mother win that fight wasn't fear of her anger. It was that some broken, still hurting part of me had decided that if I chose the strangers, it would prove she'd been right to be scared of losing me, and some other part of me still wanted, more than anything, for her to look at me the way she looked at Tessa, without effort, without a decision behind it. I didn't understand until years later, in an actual therapist's office, that a person can spend a decade chasing the approval of someone who never planned to give it freely, because giving it freely would mean admitting there was ever anything to withhold. 6 years passed. I built a career I was proud of. I moved into vital records work specifically, and if you want to know the truth, I think some invisible part of me chose that specialty on purpose, the way people who survive house fires sometimes become firefighters. I learned the exact statutory language for adoption record access in 12 different states before I ever used it for myself. I met Daniel at a mutual friend's wedding 2 years ago, and he proposed on a Tuesday in October with a ring his grandmother had left him. No audience, no rehearsal, just the two of us in our kitchen, which felt right to me in a way I couldn't fully explain until later. We set a date. We started planning a wedding in Portugal, where his mother's family is from. Small and simple, 40 guests, a courthouse in the morning and a dinner by the water at night. And that meant passports. I'd let mine expire in my 20s and never renewed it, so this spring I sat down to apply for a new one, expecting a formality. Instead, 6 weeks after I submitted my application, I got a letter from the passport office requesting additional documentation, specifically a certified copy of my birth certificate issued by the county, because the one on file, an amended certificate listing Carol and Frank Kessler as parents, had triggered what the letter called a records discrepancy requiring manual review. I know exactly what that sentence means because I've written versions of it myself for clients. It means somewhere in the county's vital record system, there are two entries under the same case number that don't match cleanly, and a human being now has to look at both before they'll issue a document. I drove to the county clerk's office myself instead of waiting for the mail, because 12 years of training told me that if I wanted the truth, I needed to be the one standing at the counter when it surfaced. The clerk pulled the full case file, not just the amended certificate my mother had always shown me, but the sealed original underneath it, along with something I hadn't expected, a supplemental petition filed 6 years ago, requesting the file be moved from standard seal to a heightened restriction, the kind reserved for cases where a party has formally objected to future contact. The petitioner's signature line read Carol Kessler, Guardian, dated 11 days after I'd told my mother I'd stopped talking to Renata. She hadn't just made me choose, she'd gone to a courthouse and quietly petitioned to make the choice permanent, using a guardianship authority that had legally expired 6 years before I turned 18. I stood at that counter and read her signature twice to make sure my eyes weren't doing something dramatic to a document that was actually ordinary. It wasn't ordinary. It was forged authority on an expired power, filed to seal a door I hadn't even known she'd found the key to again. If you've ever found out that the person who was supposed to protect you spent your whole life quietly making sure you couldn't leave, you know exactly what that county clerk's fluorescent lighting felt like against my skin. Stay with me and subscribe, because what I found in that file next is the reason I finally understood the word she burned 12 years ago. Underneath the sealed petition was something my mother never knew still existed. Adoption agencies in my state are required to keep a duplicate of any letter a birth parent leaves on file, separate from the file itself, in a secure archive the adopting family never has access to. The clerk found it cross-referenced under my case number. A photocopy of a handwritten letter, dated the year I was born, from Naomi Reyes. I read it standing at that counter, with my hands shaking so badly the clerk asked if I needed water. Naomi wrote that she was 19, that she loved me enough to give me a life she couldn't yet provide, and that she was asking the agency, in writing, to hold a letter for me telling me she hoped I'd come looking when I turned 18, and that her family, my birth grandparents, had set aside a modest educational trust in my name to be released to me directly through the agency once I reached that age. No strings, no obligation to make contact, simply theirs to give. There was a second document behind it, a trust disclosure form, never claimed, sitting untouched for 12 years because the only people who could have told me it existed were the agency, who assumed my adoptive family had passed the letter along the way they were supposed to, and my mother, who burned the version of that letter she'd been given and never told the agency she'd done it. She hadn't burned an empty folder. She'd burned a promise that was never hers to break. And she'd done it, I understood standing there, not out of protectiveness, but because somewhere in that file was proof that another family had never stopped wanting me. And she couldn't stand the idea that I might someday know that. 12 years and a passport application for a wedding in Portugal was the thing that finally cracked it open. I want to pause here and tell you something my coworker Priya said to me the week before the engagement dinner. because she was the only person who told me not to bring the file with me that night. We were in the break room, and I told her what I'd found, and she went quiet for a long moment and said, "Nora, you don't have to do this at a party. You could mail her copies. You could see a lawyer first." She wasn't wrong to worry, but I told her the truth, which is that I'd spent 12 years managing my mother's comfort around a story that was mine, and I was done doing that quietly, in private, on her schedule. I wasn't going for revenge. I was going because Renata had written to me the week before, out of nowhere, after 6 years of silence, just to say Naomi still asked about me every year on my birthday. And something in me finally understood that the only person who'd ever made this feel like a scandal was my mother, and I was tired of borrowing her shame. I set one rule for myself that week, the way I imagine a lot of you have set rules before walking into rooms like this. I wrote it on a sticky note on my dashboard. Truth, not theater. If it starts to become theater, I leave. The engagement dinner was at my parents' house, not a restaurant, which should have told me something, because my mother has never once hosted anything important without an audience she could control. Daniel's parents flew in from out of state. Tessa was there with her husband. My mother had invited her sister, my Aunt Diane, and 2 of her closest friends from the fundraising committee, women who'd known me since I was in elementary school, and who I suspect she wanted in the room specifically because they'd remember me as the good, quiet, grateful version of myself. 16 people around 2 pushed-together tables in her dining room, white tablecloth, her good china out again, the same china that had been sitting in the cabinet the night she told me the truth in the worst way she knew how. It started warm, toasts, laughter, Daniel's mother asking sweet, ordinary questions about the wedding venue, about whether we'd do a family tree display the way she'd seen at another wedding, tracing both families back a few generations for the guestbook table. My mother's smile went tight around the edges the second the word family tree left the room. Daniel's mother, with no idea what she was stepping into, turned to me and asked warmly whether I knew much about my side, and my mother answered for me before I could open my mouth. "Nora's side is right here at this table," she said, a little too fast, a little too bright. Then, when Daniel's mother pressed gently, curious, not unkind, my mother set down her fork and said the sentence she'd clearly rehearsed sometime that week. "We don't need to drag up the past to know who this family is." Around the table, my Aunt Diane nodded like she'd heard this line before, which she probably had. Tessa looked down at her plate. And I understood, watching my mother's face, that she'd built this whole gathering as a preemptive strike, a room full of witnesses primed to agree with her before I ever said a word, exactly the way she'd once told 16-year-old me that people who ask too many questions about the past are ungrateful for the present. I want you to notice something here, because it's the same trick my mother had used my entire life. She never said I was wrong to want to know where I came from. She simply made wanting to know sound like an insult to everyone currently sitting at the table. Aunt Diane picked up the thread without being asked, the way family members do when they've been quietly recruited. "Your mother sacrificed so much for you, Nora," she said, reaching over to pat my hand. "The least you can do is let old business stay old business." I felt the familiar pull, the one that had kept me quiet for 12 years, the instinct to smooth things over, laugh it off, protect the room's comfort at my own expense. I set my glass down instead. Sparkling water, the same order I've made at every family dinner since I turned 21 and decided I never wanted to blur a single memory of these conversations. I told them, calmly, that I'd applied for my passport for the wedding and that the application had come back flagged for a records discrepancy. My mother's face changed before I finished the sentence, the particular stillness of someone recalculating in real time. I said I'd gone to the county clerk's office to sort it out. I watched her hand tighten around her wine glass. I said I found a supplemental petition filed 6 years ago to seal my adoption file under heightened restriction, signed by her, using guardianship authority that had already expired. The table went quiet the way tables go quiet when everyone realizes they're watching something they weren't invited to see. My mother said, too quickly, "That was to protect you, Nora. You have no idea what those people could have wanted from you." I asked her what people. She didn't answer. I reached into my bag and set the photocopied letter from Naomi Reyes on the white tablecloth, next to the good china, the same table where she'd once told me family takes precedence over truth. I read it out loud. Not the whole thing, just enough. "I love you enough to give you a life I couldn't yet provide. I hope, when you're old enough, you'll come looking, because I never stopped hoping you would." My mother's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Daniel's mother had gone very still, her hand over her mouth. My mother said, voice shaking now, "That woman gave you up. I'm the one who raised you." I told her I knew that, and that I'd never once forgotten it, and that raising me and erasing the people who loved me before I could remember them were two different things, and she'd chosen to do both at once and call it protection. I told her about the trust, 12 years untouched, waiting at the agency because she'd burned the letter that was supposed to tell me it existed. Uncle Diane's mouth actually fell open at that. My mother said, "And this is the third time you're hearing this sentence, and I need you to feel the weight of it landing differently now than it did in that kitchen 12 years ago. You were given to us, Nora. That's what mattered." I looked at her, 16 faces watching, my fiancé's hand finding mine under the table, and I said, "I was given to you. I was never given away by anyone who stopped loving me. You just made sure I never knew the difference." My father hadn't said a word this whole time. He'd gone quiet the way he always did during my mother's storms, but this time, when I finally looked at him, I saw something I hadn't seen in 12 years. Shame, plain and unguarded. He said very quietly, "Carol, you told me the agency lost that letter." My mother didn't answer him. That was the moment the room finally understood this wasn't a disagreement between a mother and daughter about ancient history. It was a woman confronted, in real time, by proof that she'd lied to her own husband for over a decade to protect a decision she'd made alone, in the dark, with a match and a folder that never belonged to her. I didn't raise my voice once during any of this, and I want to explain why. Because I think it's the most important thing I can tell you if you're watching this and bracing for your own version of that table. My mother had spent my whole life needing the story to be loud so she could win it on emotion. Calm was the one thing she'd never trained me to defend against. I stood up, not dramatically, just the way you stand when a meal is over. I told her I wasn't asking for an apology at that table in front of an audience, because I'd learned from her exactly how little a performed apology is worth. I told her I was going to see a family law attorney about the improperly filed seal, not to punish her, but because it was mine to unseal, and I intended to claim what was mine. All of it. The file, the letter, and the trust that had been sitting untouched since before I'd even learned to drive. Then I picked up my water glass, the same plain, quiet drink I'd been nursing all night, took one last sip, and set it down. Here's what happened after, delivered plainly, because I think the plain version matters more than a triumphant one. My attorney confirmed within a week that the 6-year-old sealing petition was invalid on its face, filed under expired authority, and helped me file to have the original record properly released to me as an adult under the Mutual Consent Registry, which took 11 weeks and one signed form from the agency once I formally requested contact. The educational trust, 12 years matured, was still there, exactly where Naomi's family had left it, and it covered nearly the entire cost of the wedding Daniel and I had been quietly worried about affording. My mother did not go to jail, did not get sued, did not lose her house. I want to be clear about that because some of you are expecting a bigger fall, and I think it's important to say plainly that most of the time, the consequences for people like my mother are smaller and quieter than the crime feels. What she lost was simpler and, I think, harder for her. She lost the version of the story where she was the only mother who ever mattered. My father moved into the guest room for 6 weeks, not permanently, but long enough to tell me later that it was the first time in 30 years he'd let himself be angry at her out loud, instead of just absorbing it on my behalf. Tessa, who had said nothing at the table, called me 2 days later, crying, and told me she'd known for years that something in the story didn't add up, that she'd once seen a folder in Mom's closet with an agency letterhead on it and never asked. And she was sorry, genuinely, quietly sorry, in the specific way that people are sorry when they finally admit they chose comfort over courage. She's the only one who apologized, and she's the only one I've let back in close. I met Naomi Reyes 6 weeks after that dinner, in a diner exactly halfway between our two cities, because she said she didn't want me to have to drive the whole way alone. She brought a photo album she kept opening and closing, unsure if she'd earned the right to show me yet. She has my exact chin. She cried when she saw me and apologized for crying, and I told her she'd waited 30 years to be allowed to. She didn't need my permission anymore. Renata was there too, and she hugged me the way you hug someone you've been saving a place for. Naomi told me, the third time we met, the sentence I think about more than almost anything else anyone has ever said to me. She said, "I never stopped hoping you'd come looking. And I want you to know, whatever that woman told you, you were never given away by anyone who stopped loving you for even a single day." I sat in that vinyl booth and thought about 12 years of my mother's sentence, "You were given to us," and understood finally that she'd never once been talking about how I arrived. She'd been talking about ownership the whole time, and Naomi, without even trying, had just handed me the real ending to that sentence. I was given to a family. I was never taken from the people who loved me first. My mother called once, about 2 months after the dinner, and asked if we could talk, just the two of us, no audience this time. I agreed, mostly because I wanted to see if she could say the word sorry without a qualifier attached to it. She couldn't. She said she was sorry I'd found out the way I did, sorry it had happened in front of Daniel's family, sorry the timing was so public. Every apology wrapped around the method and never once touching the decision itself. I told her I appreciated her calling and that I loved her, both of which were true, and that I wasn't ready to have a relationship built on the same silence that had shaped the last 12 years. She hasn't asked me to explain that again, and I haven't offered to. Here's what I've learned, and I think it's the only thing that matters at the end of a story like this one. A family that has to burn the evidence to keep you isn't protecting you. It's protecting a version of the story where you never had a choice. I don't hate my mother. Hate would mean she still gets to be the center of the story, and I've spent enough of my life letting her be that. I'm getting married in Portugal this fall, in a small courthouse in the morning and a dinner by the water at night, and Naomi is walking me in, alongside my father, because both of those things can be true at once, that he raised me and that she never stopped loving me, and neither one erases the other. That's the whole lesson, if you're looking for one. You don't have to choose between the people who raised you and the truth of where you came from. You only have to stop letting anyone convince you that knowing the truth is a betrayal of the love you were given. If someone in your life has ever told you the past was too dangerous for you to have, I want you to hear this. It was never too dangerous. It was just too inconvenient for them. That's my story. One burned file, one flagged passport, and a letter that outlived the fire it was supposed to have died in. If this resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight for the truth about your own life, drop a comment and tell me. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because I have a feeling some of you are sitting on a file of your own, waiting for the right moment to finally open it. I'll see you in the next one.